information. Go back into, certainly do not say your social security number, please. And start the webinar. All right, so yes, hello everybody. Thank you for coming to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus 2021, cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org. And this is being streamed live as well as happening in person here at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. We thank our partners for letting us use their space to do these cool events. And this is going to be a really good one. You're going to be really glad that you came. And now that I say that this is streaming live, wherever you're watching it, you can make comments, you can ask questions, and we're going to be monitoring the chats. And also, if you are in the Zoom webinar, you can ask questions either in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be relaying them to our great presenter, who you will meet momentarily. First, I need to hand this over to Caitlin McGurk of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus 2021. CXC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our annual festival, free to the public, relies on corporate and grant sponsorship, as well as individual donations. We're grateful for their support. Visit the Support CXC link on our website to find out how you can help us create meaningful connections between the people who make comics and those who read them. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the Eastern Woodlands tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. We hope you enjoy this event. Don't forget to visit our virtual expo at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org and keep the conversation going in our Discord channel, which you can find at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org/Discord. Okay, and now on to our main event. Kay Clopton is the Mary P. Key resident of Cultural Diversity Inquiry here at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, and an amazing colleague. She earned her PhD in 2018, studying sound and emotive effects in North American comics and Japanese manga, and how they impact the reading experience. Kay's current research focus centers around research of sound in comics and its connections to memory. A Cleveland native, Kay's favorite hobby is to read comics and sound out the effects. Welcome, Kay.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am here with you today to talk about sound effects in comics. If you didn't figure that out, yes, boom, snap, I am all about the noise today. So sound effects are the words and images that enliven the page, whether they are the big boom of an explosion or the subtle snap of a twig. In their own way, sound effects are the accompanying soundtrack to the dialogue and images one sees in comics. This presentation will be a brief history of the appearance of sound effects in comic books and comic strips, largely from North America, and we will look at sounds in strips, comic books, graphic novels, and because I can't leave it out, manga. And this will give us an idea of how the use of sounds in comics have changed over time. So I have a question for everyone in the room and everyone online. What do you think of when you first think of sound effects in comics? I used to teach and I'm good with silence, so I can wait till that. There you go. Yes. Yes. Yes, these are all true. That and more. So what do I say are sound effects in comics? There are two types. There are the onomatopoeia, they're the word ones, and then there is emanata. Most of us are familiar with the boom, pow, the jagged lines. Even when they flow freely, we're very familiar with that type of sound. Now, what we may not be familiar with is the term emanata. These are the effects that are lines, they're the stars. And this was a term coined by Mort Walker to really describe these effects that are still an effect, but more of an action or sometimes an emotion, especially with this example where the lady is concerned, her slip is showing, she's sweating a little, and then her shoulder strap breaks, she's sweating some more. And then it's up to your imagination to figure out what else happened to her outfit. So these are all things that all play into this sound effect spectrum. What makes sound interesting is that they could do more than just convey sound. A vroom can be written where it travels across the screen, or it could be so strongly associated with an object that the sound evokes specific things in the listener / reader. Yeah, I actually hear these things, so I sometimes say listener, reader, I say everything. What I argue in my research is that we can look at these items and say that they are their own language in comics. And while I find that to be completely fascinating, I realize that not everyone shares my enthusiasm. So instead, I'm going to talk about sound in comics and lay some groundwork. In this talk and teach, I'm going to look at sound effects in comic books and strips from North America for a good bulk of the talk, but I'll also talk about graphic novels and manga so that you can see some differences and how they're used so that you can also see the styles. This will be a history-ish look at how things have evolved. Yeah, we're doing history lights today, folks. So let's start with the beginnings. So sound effects in comics have had a long history. All one has to do is look at George Herriman's KRAZY Cat, which was published from, this one I think was 1919. And the infamous pow of the brick that hits KRAZY in the back of the head as an early example. A running gag in the strip is that KRAZY Cat is in love with Ignatz the mouse and mistakes the brick thrown at them, because their gender is indeterminate, as a sign of love. Some strips emphasize the pop of the brick hitting, while others, like this one, a zip pow. So you hear that. It's traveling and it hits. It has an impact. And so these are done to make a very strong emphasis that you are paying attention that this impact is happening. And that for whatever reason, KRAZY just thinks that Ignatz loves them for it. Okay. Next one is POPEYE. We're going back to Thimble Theater, and these actually help to illustrate how sound effects in North American comics are utilized for sound when someone really wants to emphasize something. So in this particular example, we have POPEYE getting shot at and apparently being a superpowered person and not dying. I don't know if he was like super saiyan or something back in 19 whatever, but yeah, he's been shot 15 times. The bang is for the 16th time, but when he goes to punch the guy, instead of the pow of him hitting him, you get the emanata of the stars. So you get that visual emphasis of what he's doing, but for the shot, it's easier to emphasize bang, as opposed to trying to draw a bullet flying through the air. We've gotten better, I promise. But because we see those stars and the music notes, there are music notes as well, brings whole new meaning to getting his bell rung. In the second example, this is actually an early interaction with POPEYE and olive oil. She walks by, kisses him, and you hear that smack. And she says, "Oh, excuse me, POPEYE, I imagined you were my lover." And that's when he falls in love with her. So even though the smack is loud, we get a little thump with the emanata to show that's his first time falling in love with olive oil. History began at that moment. So these effects come into play alongside dialogue and image, but they serve as punctuation, which is very common in a lot of these comics. We see this in comic books as well. So of course, got to bring up Superman. In this Superman comic, he actually says, "I'm going to shoot you," and shoots the guy with his own gun. And again, you hear the bang, but what he does is he catches the bullet before it hits him. So you don't hear that he catches it, but you do see the emanata of the lines and the action that he did, straight up try to murder this guy, but just kidding. So interesting. But then of course, got to bring my Wonder Woman into this. That's my gal. What we have with this is 1940s Wonder Woman. And you see that she's deflecting bullets with her bracelets, but the sound is not about the bracelets. It's the rat-a-tat-tat. So I'm assuming it's a Tommy gun that's shooting at her while she's in a box, and she's having to untie herself and deflect the bullets while in a box. She's that amazing. And it's that crazy. But you don't hear the sounds on her bracelets. You have emanatolons shooting off instead. That will be important later, so remember that one. So whether she's deflecting bullets or doing plane crashes, the sounds help with illustrating what either cannot be drawn or to emphasize what is occurring. So can't really do the sound effects on the bracelets yet, but with this last panel, what I love about it is that you hear the sound of the plane as it's dive bombing and landing on this car. And what you have is, and it's just moving around and you can just hear the travel. And she realizes there's a problem. But then when it explodes, there's no boom, there's no dokkan, there's no word, but you see the impact as the plane hits this car. So the emphasis is on what can't be seen. You can't see the plane. It's like if you're outside and you hear a plane and you can't figure out where it is. So that's what's going on here. So it's really giving you what isn't on the page visually, but something that you would actually be able to hear. As we move through time, we get examples that kind of push and pull against the constraints of sound in comics, and we see how effects can change over time. And a comic strip does a particularly good one at deconstructing sound effects, or Sam's strip, which ran from 61 to 1963. A comic strip by Jerry Dumas and Walt Walker that features Sam and his sidekick with an eye towards commenting on the mechanics of a comic strip while honoring strips of the past. So they were doing a lot of work with this strip. For example, there are several strips that take on the idea of sawing some logs, which is, you know, slang for taking a nap. Now there is one where Sam's trying to take a nap and gets upset because the log is mahogany, so you can't really saw it. There's another one where a sidekick shows up with extra long, saying, this is going to be a 3-log nap. And there are other ones where he has to ring the sound as well. But in other ones, we have puns and sight gags, and these are a bit more blatant. So, for example, what we have is kaboom. And they're like, what was that? Another jet breaking the sound barrier. We're nearing the new Air Force Base. So what is the Air Force Base called? Kaboom. They decided to be realistic about it. Why not? And then there's the one where Sam is trying to sell his car. He wants it to look like it runs well, so he goes to the cartoon prop closet and grabs a Zoom balloon and puts it on the car. And his sidekick says, do you really think this is honest? And so these are the things that they were doing to play with the concept of sound and really to play with the ideas and mechanics of comic strips themselves. There's a reason why this strip was considered the cartoonist cartoon, because it was really getting at the mechanics and making fun and having a good time with it. But I also said they honored the past. And in that case, they would talk about past characters. In this one, Sam wants Ignatz to sign an agreement that he will no longer throw bricks. So Sam will agree to also not throw bricks. Ignatz is like, why should I sign this? I'm the only one who throws a brick. I'm not worried about you. Zip, pow, sign, where? He deserved it. He's been doing it he did it for decades. He finally got one until that poor cat left him. But yeah, they really were trying to honor these strips, pay homage to these strips, at the same time recognizing these sounds have power and they work to entertain as well as inform. So we see this here, but we also see this in other strips as well. A more contemporary strip is For Better or For Worse. This is actually one of my favorites. Lynn Johnston is really adept at using a lot of sound, whether it's the sound of April playing with Edgar, playing pretty hard with Edgar, especially with that big thump when she lands on him, or because somebody on the internet decided they had to point this out, when she did a similar storyline earlier with a young Elizabeth with her dog Farley, and she's terrorizing the poor dog, but he gets in trouble for barking at her. But you have these moments, big and small. This one is a great one because you get both. This is a strip that just ran within the past week or so. Michael's in high school. And for the slam dunk, she actually writes in big letters, slam dunk. I'm like, that works? And everyone's excited. They won the game. He's giving fives. So you hear the slap, someone tussles his hair, which actually isn't a sound, but it's really cool that she did it. And of course, he's like, hey, watch the hair. So it's because of all these sounds, because they're always so rich in her strips, even with cigarettes and everything else, that when the sound is absent, it speaks volumes. I bring this up because in 1995, April 1995, Lynn Johnston did a storyline that turned out to be very controversial. It was a storyline where little April falls into a swollen river. Farley has to keep her head above water. And unfortunately, it was too much for him. But in those moments, especially when she falls into the river, you have no sound. It's very silent. And it's actually really unnerving. It's actually, for me, it's quite stressful because this absence of sound speaks volumes. Because the absence of these effects marks the effect's power. I mean, the image of a little girl and a dog in the middle of a raging river with absolutely no sound whatsoever is impactful. But moving on to slightly happier sounds. Archie comics. Archie comics are a particular favorite of mine because I grew up buying the comics at the grocery store. I may not have been able to tell you where a comic book store was in town, but I was not deprived of any comics. And through the original run of the series, which ended to coincide with the Riverdale television series, there were a lot of physical gags that figured into the series, making it difficult to choose just a few. I mean, we have 70 plus years of examples. It's kind of hard to winnow it down. So the effects vary from Betty flopping on the bed, and enjoying the idea of being able to just not do anything for the summer, to Veronica being blown back into the house because the weather is so bad. And I mean, they've got scream, whoosh, and wail. That was a bad storm, and that chick was not wearing enough clothing. She needed to be blown back in the house. So because of all these, this is what Archie ran on. It's like, you know, America runs on Duncan, Archie ran on gas. So even the sound of barking dogs or whistle gave dimension to the action, and it was on par with something that's representative of Archie gag comics. It's something I always enjoyed about them, that the details go into creating a gag strip weren't neglected. What most people remember about Archie are the character designs and the famous rivalries, but the sight gags are some of my favorites, with Josie and the Pussycats is my favorite of all the Archie creations. Not gonna lie, big Josie fan. I think what I really take notice of is how the lettering for the onomatopoeia that is spoken or uttered is larger and often a different color from the rest of the text. I mean, we get a sense of how loud a sound is by the size of its presentation. When presumably Veronica screams from upstairs, it's shrill. We know it is because the jacket lines, we got big red letters, we got a couple exclamation points. We know stuff's getting real. And when a crash happens between Archie and I believe that's Reggie, it's not only emphasized by an almost audible wham, but also by the very visible stars, all that emanata, at the sight of Archie being knocked out of his shoes. It's a wonderful marriage of images to really sock it to the audience. Yeah, I said it, I'm corny. So, but as a huge Josie and the Pussycats fan, I couldn't leave them out. There's a comic where the artist Dan DiCarlo drew himself as a young person who was a friend of Josie's when he loses his cool at the sight of Melody. Something that, you know, kind of hits a bit closer to home when you realize that his wife, Josie, was the inspiration for both the Josie character and the Melody character, down to her sing-song voice. What's key in the scene is that, like the previous Sam strips, DiCarlo is bouncing off the panel walls like he knows he's in a panel frame. And you actually could see that he's even trying to break the frame a bit. But he's doing all that because Melody was designed to be the hot, dumb blonde who had no idea how hot she was. She had such animal magnetism that men regularly walked into walls, into cars. They actually made her stay home from school in an early She's Josie comic because The boys were failing their physical fitness exams because she was around. That's how much power she had. I mean, Dan DeCarlo really thought highly of his wife, and I applaud him for that. Trust me, I could talk about this all day, but we're gonna stay on topic. So we're gonna move into the modern age comics. It's gonna be dark on purpose. It's also referred to by some as the dark ages of comics because of the mature and dark themes of comics at the time. The more traditional dressings of comic books, including sound effects and thought balloons, voiceover narratives, were eschewed in the name of serious presentations. Titles like The Watchmen avoided sound effects to get away from the childishness associated with sound effects that were reminiscent of the ones you would see in Adam West Batman. And in works like The Killing Joke, subtle effects are utilized, but for major events, like when Barbara gets shot, it is unearthly silent. And for the sake of, trigger warnings and how upsetting it is, I decided not to show that one. But in our more modern times, sound effects have made a return. We go back to Wonder Woman. What we're seeing are sound effects being more creatively integrated. In Wonder Woman comics, they've tried to mimic the sound as will be heard. Like, we have the nervous neighing of a horse. It's like, sounds more like a horse than neigh. That doesn't quite sound like what a horse sounds like, but we're trying. Even that's almost all vowels, and that's weird for English, but I see where they're going with it. But then we also have the shing, where this woman is sharpening and polishing a scythe. The horse sound is also an emotional reaction cue, and the shing also helps to depict the action as the scythe is going from dull and rusted to sharp and renewed. So not only are we hearing it, we're following the path of her finger, and we're seeing it as it improves. This is evident even in the effects used in a throwback comic. I love the throwbacks. This example is actually from Wonder Woman 77. And so we see the difference. Remember that Wonder Woman sound effect where she was deflecting bullets in the 40s, but we couldn't hear the sounds of the bullets. We could just hear the sound of her getting shot up. Well, now what we're getting is the emphasis on ting, ping, ka-ting, the bullets hitting her bracelets. This also recalls the Wonder Woman TV series, where you would hear the sound of the ricocheting bullets. I also think in this example, Clayface, for whatever reason, decided he wanted to go after Wonder Woman for a change of pace, and he ends up crashing into I think it's actually an active volcano. And so the sound effect we have here is plort. It just sounds so nasty, but it's so cool. Because it's just like, Clayface is just getting all dissolved up in there, and it's just really, really great. And it's just this graphic destruction that's very, grabbable for the reader. Now, graphic novels. I'm covering 3, so I'm going to try to cover them as quickly as I can. Graphic novels are sometimes sites of darker serious matter as well. They ground themselves, and which we can see in David Small's Stitches, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and the 3rd volume of March by the late John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. These graphic memoirs are examples of excellent storytelling and convergent with images and effects, the impact of which I will now discuss. Much of the drama in March is underscored by sounds that accompany the images. There are chaotic images of the attack on the marchers who tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and were attacked in the event that is referred to now as Bloody Sunday. And then there's the music that people sang when they subsequently marched after that effect. And what's great about how this is depicted is that you really get a sense of how the music is surrounding the participants. It's not just one person, it's many voices, and it encapsulates you. It's just, it's an experience that if you've never had it, it's hard to describe, because it's like the music is moving through you and helping to support you and really helping them to get through this march, especially since at this point, John Lewis was still dealing with his head injury from Bloody Sunday. So it's just that you hear it and you feel it as well. Or for another example of just active sound and how it impacts the story, when John Lewis gets a call in the middle of the night And I remember seeing it something that's really, really bad. And you have the sound of the ringing, those big white letters ringing through the darkness. But to be honest, my favorite scene in March Volume 3 is the one with Annie Lee Cooper. Annie Lee Cooper was a mad as hell and I can't take it anymore. She got shoved by the sheriff and she belted him. And when the first time I read that crack, I'll admit I cheered. But of course it's short-lived because she's immediately taken down by the other officers. But the next thing we see is the flash, click, click, click. And it's the sound of the flashbulbs going off and the sound of the cameras. And the officer realizing he's being watched. And the look on her face when she looks at him, daring him to hit her. And he hesitates before he actually beats her with the nightstick. But all the sounds come together to give you a sense of the dynamic nature of what happened. And when you compare it to photographs, because there are actual photographs of this moment, this is far more dynamic, where the photos actually feel static. And I have to actually thank Nate Powell for that one, because we actually talked about this several years ago. So give credit where credit's due, but it's just a great scene. I mean, she punched him. It was so good. I'm sorry, I'm the biggest dork, and I'm like gonna admit it. I don't care. Let's see, what are we on to next? We are on Stitches. This is a graphic memoir by David Small, and it's a fascinating one about the author's childhood in a home where everyone had their own way of speaking without talking. For example, his mother spoke by slamming cabinet doors or by coughing. Stitches in part is about David Small losing his ability to speak. This is a crisis which is evoked within the text by his use of sound as he comes to terms with his loss by finding other ways through which to communicate. If you have not read this one, go read it. We have a copy downstairs, go read it. It is just very, very powerful the way he uses sound, because it helps to underline how voiceless he feels when he can't speak. But to build up to that, he gives you just the sounds of childhood. There's a moment where he's playing with the wheelchairs at the hospital where his father works. You hear clack, clack, bang, and he leaves them there. He does not clean this up at all. This 6-year-old was like, I'm playing and I'm done and I'm gonna keep it moving. And he's just having himself a good time. But one of the most impactful moments in this, in the early part of this book, is when he's with his maternal grandmother. He says something to her that really angers her. And she grabs him up, drags him through the house, and takes him into the bathroom. That's where she turns on the water, and you could hear how hot the water is, accompanying the steam. And you know it's very clear the water is hot, and it's too hot for that young child. The sound fills the bathroom, and it's the only sound heard after she has already dragged him silently through the house. His screams are painted over his face as if it's a disembodied voice. Ultimately, David Small's use of sounds gives depth to the torturous childhood that he endured and ultimately overcame, providing a soundtrack to a powerful and moving book. Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, a family tragicomic, has a number of moments where sound effects punctuate moments in the family's lives. From an early passage, which is actually the first page, when Alison accidentally breaks the top of a crystal decanter with a giant clink, the sound that stood out in memory. And these sounds just filter through the pages. But something that gets heavily emphasized are the sounds of the locusts that happen in chapter 6. The insects have a sound that's oppressively heavy, and it weighs over the house at the beginning of the summer. And it's that really loud, kind of ring, ring, ring. If you did not hear the cicadas this summer, if you're out there where they're in force, and it can be as loud as lawnmowers, it is true. And I thought it was going to go deaf at day camp. But it is a very loud and very in-your-face presence. You know that they're there. It's like, we've been waiting 17 years, we're here now. So what makes interesting about the use of the sound, though, is that it mirrors the tensions that are surfacing involving her father's secret almost being exposed, as well as Watergate was happening at the same time. So all of this is happening together, and this sound just being everywhere seems to kind of underline that. However, as all the other crises abate, the locusts lose their volume, their mating period is ending, and they die off. The offspring burying themselves in the ground for another 17 years, seekers being buried once again. These examples give you an idea of the kind of weight and heft that sound effects can have in comics, and this is something that should not be overlooked when examining their usage in existence. So, I came to sound effects largely through manga, so I'm going to talk briefly about manga and their use of effects. So here we go. For the uninitiated, manga is the term used to refer to Japanese comics. Essentially, the word means comics in Japanese. We use it in the West to actually demarcate their particular style of comics from a Western style, and they use it for the word comics, but they understand that's how we use it now, so they're fine with it. Or at least when they do complain, we don't really seem to pay much attention. So there are two types of categorizations of sound effects that do take place: gyongo and gitaigo. Didn't think you were awesome Japanese today. Well, here we are. So gyongo are the onomatopoeia. Those are the ones that are similar to the effects that we know, and gitaigo are mimetic. So gitaigo are the emotion and action sounds that represent what's going on the page. And they could be written in katakana or hiragana. Easiest way to tell the difference, to describe the difference, I should say, is that hiragana is more like writing in cursive and katakana is more like writing in print. And for the most part, most effects are written in katakana. The occasional hiragana effect usually comes from a person or another living being. So if you see a dog barking, it's usually in hiragana, or if somebody's like breathing on someone, that's where we get that as well. Now, the first example we have is gyongo. Now, you remember that re sound that I did for the locust? Well, this is the Japanese version. This is what they hear when they hear their cicadas. Me. If you watch anime, you hear me. That's that. That's that right there. And this one happens to be in an urban setting, so it's actually a little more difficult to see, but that's actually the sound. It's just me. And it's really loud in the north. It's like, but everybody hears things differently, and this is how they depict it. Whereas with gitaigo, this one's a little difficult. This is from, that last one was KRAZY Corpse Delivery Service, really great series, by the way. And this is Helter Skelter, Fashion Unfriendly. The model is already pissed at this chick and doesn't even know who the hell she is. And so she turns and they go kuru to represent a spin. Now, you know, a spin doesn't really have a sound, but they make it clear that she is turning in annoyance to just yell at her. If you want to see someone get tortured through a book, this will do it, because there's a lot of people who suffer. The ending is interesting because the mangaka, the manga artist, ended up getting sick, so her protege had to actually finish the work for her. So the ending is slightly different than probably what was planned, which is why the live action movie is different from the manga. Yeah, fascinating facts no one needed to know, but here we are. But gitaigo also have the ability to convey things that get to emotion, and it's kind of hard to explain without giving examples. So we have a story of two blushes. There are two types of blushes you may run into in a particular manga. This one is ka. It's hot, it's sudden. In this case, she's kind of being, it's a little off-putting. But she is attracted to him, but she's trying to deny it. This is Kaito and Maid-sama. And the other one is Po. It's kind of hard to see, but it's over the maid, and it's more of a swoon. She's in love with Sebastian, who is the butler in Black Butler, and she just dissolves. But because they're both blushes, the different types give you an idea of what emotion you're supposed to go with when you see it. One of the arguments I make on how manga and comics utilize sound effects is that Western comics will often be more sparing with the sound effects. And effects tend to be worse onomatopoeic, but not necessarily detailed. For example, Tale of Two Doors. I have two doors that represent the sound of a door opening. The English language one has click, while the Japanese one has kacha, open the door. Instead of a single sound representing the door opening, The double syllable sound is capturing the turn of the knob and the tumbler catching in the door. They're both performing the same job. Letting you read it out, doors opening, but capturing different details of the sound. Now, why the detail is different is like an entire dissertation all by itself. Mine's on embargo until 2023, so you have to wait till that happens to read it. I do go into it some detail, but not very well. But I think there is something cultural to the way that we process sound versus the way others process sound. And with the Japanese, they were kind of late in the game to have an oral writing system, kind of came into, I believe, the 9th century. And so there's a reliance more on actual sound as opposed to, words. And there's also a guy, he's a naturalist who believed that the Japanese needed to get back to nature. And he would say, get rid of using kanji, use things that represent sounds. Now, if you want to know his name, it's Shoeki Ando. I'm pretty sure this is his name. He's been dead a long time. I'll have to look it up. But his whole point was going to the kana was actually getting truer to Japanese language as opposed to using kanji, which of course is derived largely from China. And so, get rid of that, get back to nature and that sort of thing. But again, there's a whole discussion on that, and we will leave that go. Often, Emanada will appear in a Western comic book or comic strip in a similar place to Gitaigo in manga. That's not to say that the visual shorthand does not also appear in manga, but they will sometimes accompany the syllable sounds that serve to indicate the reader how they're to read the reaction to the character. The use of effects is often more detailed in manga when they're used at all, and can proliferate in a series no matter the genre. So it doesn't matter if it's for boys, girls, men, or women. I don't know if they have one for dogs. They might. They have a whole bunch of ones about cats. But if they're going to use sound effects, they tend to use them, but not everybody does it, and there's no reason that everyone has to. But because my slides already skipped ahead, we're going to talk about favorites. Some of my favorite sound effects. This is actually a quote from the book Writing for Comics with Peter David. And he wrote, I don't know who first coined the sound effect, the bathroom, for an explosion, but that gave me a few giggles the first time I saw it. I came up with my own huge explosion noise, that's slightly more subtle, like a wham. And while I love these effects, and I mean, these are great, but I cannot find them anywhere, I have other styles that stand out for various reasons. One is from Wonder Woman in the 1940s. I love this. Sacco. Oh my God, I love 40s sound effects. They are just amazing. I don't know why they're so corny, but I love them. I mean, this is Steve Trevor trying to feel useful, and he's like, all right, chum, I'm on my business. This is it. It was Sacco. It's like whammo. I just love it. The second one that I refer to as a favorite is the one from Stitches with the water. And it's not because I love it, because I love seeing people being tortured. I'm not that type of idiot. I'm a different type of idiot. It's that the sound effects have such an impact because you're not just passively watching, you're an active participant with this torture. You are either feeling as if you're being tortured with him, or you feel like you're actually doing the harm. And either way, it gives this experiential moment of just terror. It's awful. But I like that it makes you feel like you understand what's going on. Like you can understand why he had such troubles as a child. To the extent that you can, to somebody who scalds a child's hands and then looks at him and say, no, ain't that better? And it's because he's made the mistake of saying, Mama says people who say ain't are stupid. And so that's why she scalded his hands. Yeah, it's that kind of messed up. He's got some bad people in his family. So my last favorite sound effect is a manga one. Ira, ira. It's the sound of irritation. And if you knew anything about me, you'd understand why I love this one. If you have been irritated, if you have experienced just people just getting on your nerves, you can feel this in your soul. It's walking around, ira, 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 ira. And usually Japanese effects, they're repetitive. They usually say them twice. And that's usually when they end up entering the lexicon. So they go from being an effect to actually being a word. And if you've seen the little, the red angry symbol, that's visual shorthand for ira, ira. But this one gets me to my soul. So why would anybody study this? Why would anyone focus on sound effects in comics? I do because I see them as a language of their own that further communicates to the reader the sounds and effects of the comic in which it resides. Effects can create an atmosphere and ground a narrative within its own universe. Sounds of loud volume or subtle sounds can convey a lot of weight. And even when the sound is attached to memory, there are emotional layers of experiencing an effect while reading a comic. Some onomatopoeia are great for gag comics or superhero stories. Others can carry the passions of love or the excitement of a thriller. But when they're in a comic, they are included for a reason. So, any questions?
We have a bunch of questions coming up in Discord server and online. Maybe in the room and anybody just get around the microphone.
Hey, you have Discord on. I have a question. Oh, I think learning.
Okay. So, as I made it clear in CM's talk earlier, I'm a big manga fan. And so I really appreciated you touching on the differences there. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about when manga is localized here, how sound effects get translated, like what the ideal way to do that is, in your opinion.
Okay, so I'm gonna get myself in trouble here. There are translators that I'm big fans of because they will either translate the effect and leave the effect there. That's a big one for me. I don't like when they're taken away or erased and replaced with English words. But that's definitely personal preference, and that's how I learned to read the hiragana and the katakana, because I'm like, I have to know what they're saying. And so I go back to a certain company's translation of the manga Nana in the first volume, when Nana K was going to the beach and they wrote splash and bubble text for the beach. It's the ocean. That's not what the ocean sounds like. That's the bathtub. I can say that forever, and I'm finally going to get caught on that one. So I've gone out and publicly said that one bothered me. I prefer, if you do a translation, you do the translation with the item if you can. My favorite translations were actually in KRAZY Course Delivery Service because they did a glossary. They didn't touch a damn thing on the page. You went to the back. And they not only did translations of the sound effects, they would give you cultural notes. So it's like reading the reading equivalent of old school fan subs, when they would actually tell you things that you may not understand, because it was 2006 when it was published in Japan, and it's 2012 here. Things have changed and the world got screwy. And so those things are helpful. I want to know what is being said. Having said that, there are people who are making strides to do translations that seem to be a bit more faithful to what the sound is capturing, and not so much trying to figure out what it's saying and tell you what you should think it says. And I will give them credit for trying and for trying to match the font a bit better. Because I can remember some of my early bad translations, you could still see the katakana in the background and they pasted over it with like boom or something. Or my other one, same company, those people are going to kid me. They're a very popular company. They get a lot of good titles. When Miyake gets slapped at Fushigi Yugi, it's pong in Japanese. In the original translation, it was thwack whack. She did not slap her twice. It was one sound. What is this? But it was to cover the space. And so I'm like, I understand what you're trying to do, and I'm a bit forgiving now. But if you'd asked me in 2018, it's like, no, burn it to the ground.
Hello, I have a question. Should, I guess, sound language be as consistent as style within a story? For example, writing step, 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 as compared to like tip, 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 tip across the floor. Does it have to be consistent in that sort of language as much as like the style? Is it fair for it to be varied?
It can vary, and sometimes it should. Like, if you're reading a manga and you hear somebody who's wearing heels, you hear ko, 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 to catch the sound of their heels hitting the floor. Now, if you have somebody who walks like I do, where your feet have two different sounds, having it have two different sounds would make a lot of sense. I don't know why my feet make two different sounds, but they do. And so being able to capture that is important. And especially since in manga, people were just making stuff up anyway, and whatever caught fire would just continue on. You have a lot of license. With North American comics, it's free game, baby. It's like, you know, Rank of Land, come on now. And Bathroom. I mean, you could do whatever you're interested in if you think it's going to capture what you're trying to do. And I think that's the important part is you want to catch your audience, and it's more important to be consistent within your own universe than consistent across the board, because sometimes it just doesn't work. And I don't want to stifle people's creativity just to say, no, it needs to be this way. Besides, it's boring. I want this stuff to be fun. That's why I read it out loud a lot.
Oh, yeah. So we have some questions from Discord, and thanks to everybody who has been talking on the Discord today. And it's a very lively conversation. Matter of fact, I am scrolling as I am vamping because I'm trying to get to some of these questions. Rodrigo Vargas, one of our exhibitors, asked, what do you think about presenting music on the page?
I love looking at music. It is the next goal in my research repertoire because I didn't get to do it for my dissertation for time constraints because I covered so much. But there's so much fun that people can do with it. I love how with 9 Chickweed Lane, he'll use body movement to indicate music. Like you can't hear the music, you don't know what's playing. He'll even tell you what concerto it is, but it's the body movement that tells you what's going on. Or there's a manga that I'm thinking of where there were 2 cello players, and one, he played beautifully, music's swirling around him. It's this gorgeous symphony, you know it's gorgeous. When you get to the girl, it's little notes that are kind of being farted out. They just look terrible. And so you get a real indication that you just went from the professionals to the amateurs like in 2 seconds. So, and I know that Terry Moore loves to actually put sheet music in his comics, which is great for me. I'm a musician, so I get to sing all of his stuff out. So music's my next frontier. I love it. I want to see more of it. I mean, from Peanuts to Tell It More to everything. We need more music in our lives, man.
Another one is, do you think at all about color when you're thinking about sound?
I do, because in Western comics, you do have color. So color has a bigger part to play. In manga, not as much, because for the most part, it's black and white, and it's largely economical. And occasionally you will have color splash pages and things of that nature. So you will see color, but the color dynamic is actually radically different. So they go with more of sound as opposed to, that's why you get wording as opposed to like picture demonstrations, because it kind of gets to the heart of the matter in a different way than with Western comics, where you can have red and you can have blue. I haven't really seen a lot of blue, but you can have the different colors that stand out. Archie actually is really good if you go to the 40s and 50s of using a lot of color. And I say that because for some reason in the 40s and 50s, they were like super violent. And I think Archie's father got his ass kicked a lot in a number of stories, which is like really strange. Like, this is not the kind of thing you could do today, but apparently it was common that he would get his ass beat for stupid stuff that Archie did. But yeah, color is important, and color can really convey a lot of meaning. I just haven't put a lot of thought into it yet because I'm trying to cover so much ground and starting this that it's like, I have to put that on the list and more things I have to think about. But yeah, color is important for the cultures that use it, and for the cultures that don't, you have to think about how do they get to that same point a different way.
I have another one. This one comes in from YouTube, and 78 Matthias asks, how much of an author's style comes from their use of sound?
Depends on the author. There are some who are very adept at using a lot of sounds. Like I already mentioned Lynn Johnson, but I say that because her use of sound is just so rich. I mean, she goes for comedy. She can pull at your heartstrings. She can do a lot with sound effects. And she does it. She did it on the regular. She would do it in color and black and white, and subtle, huge, absent, present. And it was pretty much like a signature. You knew that was part of it. With other with comic artists who just use it, you can usually tell what their style is, whether they go for a traditional boom or they go for something a bit more creative. You can see what they're trying to get at. It's kind of like why I like the Wonder Woman example I used, the horse, because that was a particular style that they were going for that was trying to go for realism. And there are actually quite a few examples, like in the first 5 pages of that particular comic, where you get a lot of rich, realistic sounds. Because I think one of the gods actually gets shot with an arrow, and you can hear the thunk as it sickeningly hits him. And I mean, it's like I've been shot with an arrow. It's like you hear it and you feel it. It gets very visceral for me. And so, yeah, depending on the artist and if they use it a lot, there is a signature. Some of them don't know they have one, but they do.
One more, and then we have to wrap it up. Dirk TD, sorry, Dirk, says, how much do you think the use of sound effects in a comic can affect how serious it is? Do you think too many sound effects could detract from a realistic mood or tone?
I think there was a time when people thought that that was true, and I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. Because you can use a lot of sounds to get to something that is very specific. Like if you're trying to create a sense of terror, you have somebody walking down an empty street. You hear of their footsteps, but you don't hear much else. Then all of a sudden, small sound of a motorcycle is coming up behind them. It gets louder. They don't know what's going on. Next thing you know, the purse gets snatched off their shoulder. They're terrified. You hear their heart racing. You hear their breath. Their breath is quickening. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And you can build that suspense with a lot of sound effects. And it's completely doable without it feeling cartoonish or childish. I mean, I love Batman. I love that animal stuff. But if that's not your bag, there's still a way to do it and still be respectful to the narrative, just because it has that weight of it being camp. There's nothing wrong with camp. Camp is great. Doesn't mean that it can't be useful. And in fact, if you want to use it to do a lot of things, you can. And I say, go for it. Right
Well,
now, I'm
with
gonna-
that, I think we should all thank Kate for this marvelous presentation.
Thank you, Kay. That was awesome. So we're going to have just a couple minutes between now and the next session, which starts at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, exploring queer expression in comic studies, the graduate students experience. So we'll see you there in a few minutes. Thank you.